previous month. So I am here today to talk to you about the 6 novels I finished reading in October. So like in September, there are a lot of European books, and everything I read this past month is also from the 20th century. I hope that you had a good reading month in October. I had a great one. I made some great discoveries last month. All the books I read in October, in fact, I read for the first time, and I would recommend every single one of those books to everyone. And if you want to find out why, you should keep watching, because hopefully I will be able to convey that when I discuss all the books individually. So I think I class October as a successful month in reading terms. It could have been more diverse, that's true, but I don't think every month should necessarily represent the whole range of great literature that there is and that I am interested in. I don't think that's possible. And I never plan my reading months in terms of diversity of any kind. I just sometimes make a list of books that I want to read for whatever reason, or I start a book and then that takes me to another book, and then that takes me to another book. It really depends on different factors and how I'm feeling at the time and what I seem to be most interested in at that given moment. But October was for me also a month which I found incredibly inspiring. So I have now made a list of books I want to read in November, which I will not disclose here because I might change my mind many times over, and that list might end up looking very different. But some of the books that I read last month have made me want to read specific books next month. So come back here in December to see how that went when I talk about it in my next monthly wrap-up. But let's now go back to October, which is what we're here for after all, and talk about the wonderful novels I read last month. By the way, I will talk about the books that I read in October in the order in which I read them. So the first book I want to talk about today is Primo Levi's memoir entitled If This Is a Man, which was first published in Italy as Se questo è un uomo in 1947. This book is a detailed description of Levi's experience in the Auschwitz concentration camp, where he was incarcerated from 1944 until the camp's liberation in early 1945. I have known about If This Is a Man for a long time and have been meaning to read it for just as long. I thought it would almost be too upsetting to read, so I kept putting it off. But then, I decided to include it in my very ambitious reading plans for 2021. Among my reading plans for this year, I decided to tackle those books that I had been meaning to read for years, but hadn't managed to for whatever reason, and that I was almost becoming a little bit embarrassed not to have read already. And I just had to include Primo Levi's memoir on that list. As I expected, reading this book was a strange and deeply moving experience, but not exactly for the reasons that I had previously anticipated. I braced myself for detailed descriptions of the horrors of a Nazi concentration camp during World War II, but what struck me the most was not the descriptions themselves, but rather the very calm, matter-of-fact style that the author chose to employ in order to talk about his experiences, what he saw and what he heard in his time as a prisoner in a concentration camp. One feels as if this book should really be read by young people, probably teenagers, I would say, at school, but I don't know if that's the case in some places. I know that I didn't have to read it at school, and I can't even remember when I first heard about this very famous book. What I can say is that I am happy that I finally read it, because it is not what I thought it would be, while at the same time it is exactly what now I would think a memoir of this kind should be. And I hope that makes sense to you as it does to me. One thing I had to deal with while reading this memoir were all the images from endless movies, TV series, mini-series and documentaries that I had seen over the years. And I realized that apart from some documentary images, actually many documentary images, mostly about the liberation of the camps. Many of my mental images actually came from narrative movies, not documentaries, but fiction. I am, of course, too young to have experienced World War II, and my family background is very distant from those experiences, thankfully. I don't have any close relatives from Central Europe or Europe in general, so everything I know about that time period in that place and the horrors of the Holocaust is mediated by my education, which can be reduced to one history class in high school, really, and mostly film and television. Yes, it is true that as a teenager, like many teenagers, I read Anne Frank's diary. As an aside, I don't think I finished it, but that's a very different kind of book. No doubt, endless books about the Holocaust are available, from textbooks to memoirs to fiction, etc. So I was a bit shocked with the realization that this was the first memoir I had read by someone who experienced the Holocaust. And this had me thinking a lot, both as I read If This Is a Man and afterward. I honestly cannot tell you whether I'd like to read more books of this kind, because as with any big historical event, there is not such a thing as the ultimate Holocaust memoir, novel, or book in general. So I don't want to feel like I've checked a box by reading this book, but I haven't reached any conclusions about this from my thinking yet. I don't know if I want to read more about the Holocaust either. It would be perhaps too obvious to say that this is, that it is too upsetting to read about something like this, but I'm still happy that I read this book, because I think a book like this could very easily be exploitative in some ways, even if the author didn't intend for it to be like that. And that is why I really appreciate Levy's sober style and his approach, which sometimes felt even clinical, but I think it is perhaps the most ethical choice, while also being highly effective to be thought-provoking for the reader. Or at least that was my experience reading this book. Primo Levi, of course, was Italian, and I have a few more books by Italian authors that I'd like to talk about to you today, because I have been reading a lot of Italian literature since the summer, mostly contemporary classics, by which I mean critically acclaimed novels from the 20th century, which are all also widely available in English translation. And as usual, I am linking to all the different editions in English, and when possible in the original language, in the description box for this video, so you can check them out if you're interested. So the next book I would like to talk about today is one of the most famous Italian novels from the 20th century, I think. I'm referring to Zeno's Conscience by Italo Svevo, which was first published in 1923 as La Coscienza di Zeno. The first thing that struck me about this novel is that while I struggled a little bit with the style, I thought it was a little bit over-descriptive, and the pace I found unnecessarily slow at times, I didn't feel like this novel was from the 1920s. In other words, it felt like I was reading a novel that could have been published this very year. Perhaps that comes, that feeling I had comes out of my ignorance when it comes to Italian fiction. As I said, I've only read a handful of Italian novels, and most of that reading has happened in the last 2 or 3 months. So I am hardly an expert on Italian literature, and I don't pretend to be one, okay? But as I read this novel and I pictured in my head what was happening in the different scenes, which is something that comes very naturally to me when I read a novel like this that is so rich in descriptions. Anyway, as I read this novel, I did not picture the characters as people from the 1920s necessarily, because there is very little that would make me think that this novel was set in that decade, or I don't know, in the 1910s maybe. This novel feels incredibly contemporary to me, and I mean that as a compliment. Because although I know that some people like to read classics because they want to see how people used to live, what they used to wear, what kind of customs they had, and so on. And I think that's all very valid, by the way. I think we also like to see ourselves in the novels we read. I think that we, or at least I, want to be able to recognize the characters and the situations. And everything in this novel feels so familiar and up to date. And perhaps that's what I'm trying to say here. This novel did not feel outdated at all. This is, I think, one of the reasons it has perhaps become a modern classic. Anyway, this is the story of a man who struggles with his smoking habit. He spends much of the novel trying to stop smoking, so the novel, it's meant to be written from the notes or recordings, I'm not quite sure right now, that his psychoanalyst has made from what his client, i.e. the main character, has told him. So Zeno's Conscience is a fictional memoir. As I said, I struggled a little bit with the style, or to be frank with you, I was bored with some passages, but I would still recommend this novel. Overall, I really liked it. And it is funny because I'm not a smoker. I have never even smoked one cigarette in my whole life. But still, I could understand Zeno's obsession, I think. I think we all have something that we're addicted to somehow, or if not addicted to, because I don't think most people are actually addicts, thankfully, but there is always something that we could easily become obsessed with or addicted to. And I think we are all aware of what that could be for us. And that's how I could connect with this novel, even though I found Zeno's behavior quite despicable at times. But he's also, you know, a deeply human character, someone you could empathize with in a book, even though you don't necessarily agree with everything he says or does. And that, to me, makes this novel, Zeno's Conscience, fascinating. I'm not going to go into the plot of this novel here because I always avoid spoilers on my reviews, as you know, and I think you guys appreciate that. And whenever I talk about the plot, I always signpost it, but I'm not going to go into the plot right now because it's not even the most interesting thing about this novel to me. But I will say that what you're going to get if you pick this novel up is an insight into an early 20th century male character's mind. This is a profoundly psychological novel, as the title implies. You will follow the character through different episodes in his life, although the novel is not organized chronologically, so there is a lot of jumping around, but in a way that makes sense, I think, and is not difficult to grasp. And despite being a novel from the early 20th century, so before World War II, I think most readers would be able to understand what gets this guy ticking, and I think many of us right now share similar fears to the ones explored in this novel. Okay, then I have two novels by two different writers, Dino Buzzati and J.M. Coetzee, from two different countries, Italy and South Africa, that I think are great companions. I will talk about them chronologically in terms of when they were first published, but also in terms of the order in which I read them. So the first one is a novel entitled The Tartar Steppe by Dino Buzzati, and was first published in Italy with the title Il deserto dei Tartari in 1940. This is probably one of the most fascinating, strange novels I have ever read, and the strangest one I read in October for sure. The Tartar Steppe is an ostensibly simple novel, at least in terms of its narrative. The novel takes place in a fort, in a desert, where the protagonist, Drogo, has been outposted. So everyone at the fort expects the so-called barbarians or Tartars to invade at any moment. Yet time goes by and the much-awaited Tartan invasion does not come. Of course, I'm not going to tell you whether it does eventually happen or not and what happens to Drogo, because I would love you to read this amazing novel and find out for yourself. Now, the author of this novel, Dino Buzzati, drew inspiration from a poem entitled Waiting for the Barbarians by the Greek writer Constantine P. Cavafy. And the next novel I have for you today was not only also inspired by that poem, but also took its name directly from it. Waiting for the Barbarians by J.M. Coetzee was first published in 1980 and was inspired by both Cavafy's poem and Buzzati's novel. And I think it makes for a great companion book to The Steppe of the Tartars. So, you know, I am really glad I read both novels in quick succession and in that particular order. Waiting for the Barbarians is also set on a border area in a frontier by a desolate place. In this case, the barbarians are the indigenous people from the area, the ones who live outside the borders of the empire with capital E. Because this novel is by a South African writer, and it was written at a time when apartheid was still in place in South Africa. It is very easy to read this novel as a post-colonial and anti-imperialist narrative, and I don't doubt that that's how it should be read, but I want to say that Waiting for the Barbarians is in no way a political pamphlet. It does not preach to the reader because it is more complex and more beautiful than a political pamphlet could ever be. Waiting for the Barbarians is just a great novel. What can I say? It is narrated by its protagonist, a magistrate whose name we don't know, who gradually becomes not just disenchanted with imperial policies, but also suffers its ruthless, inhumane, arbitrary actions himself. As in The Steppe of the Tartars, in Waiting for the Barbarians, there is the constant fear or threat of an imminent invasion by the so-called barbarians, even though, ironically, the so-called barbarians are the indigenous people. And those who are afraid of them are the colonizers. To me, Waiting for the Barbarians is perhaps the best anti-colonial fiction that I have ever read, and I want to read more by J.M. Coetzee. I am so surprised and kind of disappointed with myself that I haven't read already a lot of his books, because one of my all-time favorite books is his 1999 novel Disgrace, which I have reviewed here on this channel, and I am going to link to that review here because I would like you to watch it, and hopefully that will make you want to read the novel too. Okay, next I have another Italian novel, but more importantly, one of the best novels I have read in a long time, and possibly my favorite Italian novel so far. I'm referring to Contempt by Alberto Moravia, which was first published in 1954. The Italian title is Il Disprezzo. This is the story of a young writer named Riccardo Molenti, who, despite himself, stoops down to write screenplays. He thinks that's way beneath him, and yet he writes for the movies because of the money he earns from them. But this novel is also about his relationship with his wife, Emilia. Their relationship is not as hot and exciting as it once was, not even that long ago. And this novel is an exploration of that too. But I didn't necessarily love this novel because of its plot, but mostly because of the style. I'm not saying that I did not like the plot, because I did. I was very interested in Riccardo's marriage and in his career and what he thought about both. For example, at some point, he gets into this project of adapting Homer's Odyssey, and there is this particular scene in the novel where he argues about what he thinks the Odyssey is about and how it should be adapted to the big screen with the director and the producer. And in that scene, he also talks about James Joyce's Ulysses, perhaps, showing off a little bit, and also perhaps inadvertently to demonstrate that he is too talented and intellectual to be reduced to writing movie scripts. But there is a lot more about how he sees the Odyssey and how his situation with his wife affects his interpretation. I had a great time reading this novel. I did not struggle with the style at all, which is something that I had encountered with other Italian novels from that period. So this was incredibly refreshing for me to read. Last month, so in the month before, I read a novel entitled Arturo's Island, which I talked about in my wrap-up for last month, and I'm going to link to that here as well in case you're interested and haven't watched it. That novel, Arturo's Island, is by Elsa Morante, who was Alberto Moravia's wife. And while I enjoy Morante's novel, I did find it a little bit plodding, so I wasn't exactly looking forward to reading Contempt because I thought the style might be similar. But I was so pleasantly surprised by how breezy, how refreshing this novel is, that I'm not sure if I will read anything else by Morante. At least I'm not in a hurry to do so, but now I want to read more novels by her husband Alberto Moravia. I'm also fascinated by the fact that Contempt is semi-autobiographical. Most novels about writers and or novels that have a writer as the main character tend to be autobiographical anyway, but this one I think would have been kind of painful for his wife to read, I imagine. But I admire a writer who can be so frank, because it's not like he paints himself in a better light than his wife here. They are both flawed people who don't always do their best, or whose intentions are not always pure or even clear. So this is an adult book for adults, and I really appreciated that. If you're married or in some kind of long-term relationship, I think this novel might speak to you, even if you don't want to hear what it has to say about relationships. But I also want to emphasize how simple, straightforward, economical the style is, which makes this novel so easy and pleasurable to read. I cannot wait to read more by Alberto Moravia. Okay, we've made it to the final book now, which is a novel, if I can classify it as such, that I've seen a lot of people reading recently, even though it is not by any means a recent novel. I am talking about The Rings of Saturn by the German writer W.G. Sebald. Now, this novel was first published in German in 1999, and its original title is Die Ringe des Saturn, eine englische Wallfahrt. One of my mini reading projects or goals is to read W.G. Sebald's most famous books before the end of this year. I read one of his other novels, Austerlitz, many years ago and loved it, so I don't really understand why it has taken me so long to read another book by him. Of course, it has been so long since I first read Austerlitz that I also want to read that again, but I thought that rather than rereading that novel, I would read his other famous books that I had not read yet first, and would leave Austerlitz till last. So I chose to read The Rings of Saturn in October because probably because I saw a lot of people reading it and talking about it, although not always well. I think most people I heard talking about this book praised it, but not everyone. It's not a unanimous bet, and what I love about it might be something that you hate. I don't know. It is to me a very unusual book anyway. There is a first-person narrator who walks around Suffolk, which is an area of East Anglia that I'm not at all familiar with. Some of you might know that I used to live in Britain. I lived in Britain for many years, but I never went anywhere near East Anglia. So the landscape that the narrator describes is not really familiar to me, and I don't know if I would have felt differently about this book had that area been familiar to me. So the narrator goes around always by foot, and he describes what he comes across and finds striking, and that usually makes him think about something else. So this is a book of digressions, but almost methodical digressions, scientific digressions. So as I read this book, I felt that there was planning and order, as perhaps too stereotypically I would expect from a German writer. There is a lot about different historical periods, but not only that, there's also stuff about writers and scientists and buildings, and despite, or perhaps because of, the complex syntax of most paragraphs in the novel, the narrative flows, and I found this book quite compelling and almost a page-turner, even though in no way would it fit into most people's description of a page-turner, because it practically has no plot that one could follow or summarize. But I enjoyed the ride, or rather the walk with Sebald's narrator. I have the feeling that all his books are a bit like this one, because what little I can remember about Austerlitz sounds incredibly similar to what I read in this book. What I mean is that reading this book reminded me of the experience I had with that other novel by him. But I want to say that if all Sebald's novels are like The Rings of Saturn, I will not only not consider that a problem, but actually a triumph, because I found the reading experience with this book immersing, soothing, evocative, and transporting. And that's not something that I would expect from every novel, and it's not something that I would necessarily want to experience every time I pick up a work of fiction. But the thought that I could experience that from reading books by this author is strangely comforting. I mean, knowing that you will have a very specific experience that you find enjoyable if you read an author's books, I think that's priceless, and it is not something that I often encounter, even though I tend to read more than one book by the same author if I enjoyed their work. So I am looking forward to exploring more of Sebald's fiction and reporting back in future videos. But now I would love to hear about the books you read in October, so please let me know in the comments section down below. And I will see you again very soon on my next video. Bye!